can be no more important duty for politicians than the defence of Australia. Why then do they seem to be trying to make Australia defenceless, running down morale, disencouraging enlistment, and making the country generally defenceless? Soldiers have just been through a 4-year-long investigation of what has happened in relation to the SAS in Afghanistan. And throughout that, the presumption of innocence seems to have been abandoned. Journalists were given special access to the investigation. They published all manner of things, and the soldiers didn't receive legal aid to help them defend themselves. Unlike refugees or anybody claiming to be a refugee who are handed legal aid on a platter, our soldiers received nothing. And now we have the report. It's been released without names. It's been released. It is now a stain on the SAS and indeed on the Defence Forces together. The Prime Minister, in indicating that the report would be released, said it contained brutal truths. And how could it contain brutal truths when a jury hasn't yet been impaneled? A jury hasn't come to its verdict. Is this not a preemption of the truth, of the findings, of whatever happens in relation to this investigation? And even then, we're told now, after 4 years, yet another investigator will be appointed, or indeed a team of lawyers to investigate and decide on prosecutions. And all this will occur in an indeterminate time. How many more years of the lives of young soldiers are going to be taken out and damaged and seriously ruined, with some of them wondering whether it's worth going on? This is a terrible thing that we are doing to a number of our soldiers, and not only in the SAS. And in the meantime, the biggest defence contract is still there, and it's to buy 12, which many experts say are 12 obsolete submarines. The Turnbull submarines are going to cost, apparently in all, during the period of their lives, $200 billion, and they'll cost about $80 billion to buy from the French manufacturers, who have to change them and make them subject to an obsolete form of transport. They won't even be together as a fleet. They won't all be delivered for the centenary of the Second World War, when there'll be a major military and naval review in Sydney, probably in Sydney Harbour, and we won't have all of the 12 even there together in 2045. In the meantime, the politicians seem to have turned the Defence Forces into a social laboratory. If you look at the criteria, the selection criteria for soldiers, including combat soldiers, you'd think that the very last sort of soldier they want is a healthy young man. This is not the first time that soldiers have been subject to unfair prosecutions. Back in 2009 in Afghanistan, some of our soldiers were advancing towards a compound and they were fired on. And naturally, they returned fire. Now, unfortunately, when they returned fire, that fire also hit a number of civilians. The soldiers weren't to know there were civilians in the compound, and what were they to do when they were fired on? I think most people with common sense would say, well, this is unfortunate, but nothing can be done about it. In the air-conditioned offices of Canberra, apparently things are seen differently. And the Director of Military Prosecutions launched a prosecution against the soldiers, charging them with manslaughter for doing no more than doing what you have to do as a soldier. Fortunately, when the case came on before a court-martial, and you can imagine the trauma on those soldiers, knowing that they were about to be prosecuted, not knowing where this would end. Fortunately, the head of the tribunal examining them, the court-martial, the officer, decided that these prosecutions were bad in law. You couldn't sustain them because how could you argue that the soldiers owed any duty of care in relation to the civilians who were in the compound whom they didn't even know existed? The politicians have to avoid being unjust to our soldiers, dragging these things out for years and years, exposing them to unfair publicity in the media. What the politicians have to do, and particularly in relation to our soldiers, is to ensure that those willing to die for their country are at least entitled to the presumption of innocence. Another reason, I'm sure you would agree, for Australians to take back their country from their politicians.